Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus. Call me Noctis. Today is something a little different from what I've been doing lately, as in I'm not designing any characters today or working with some other concept. Instead, I'm just sort of messing around and drawing an environment to try out a range of things I've not fit into recent works or just simply not done in a while. It has been a fair few months, I think, since I last drew just an environment on its own, without any figures in it, if we take away the work that I've done for Charmed. The last time I did, it had also been coursework too, or for Charmed, so it was something that I've wanted to do for a while myself. And yes, this is something simpler. It sort of helps me out a little bit more this week than one of my other ideas would. There are some things going on behind the scenes, and I originally had the Elements Part 2 planned for this week, only that now an accompanied part of it isn't quite ready yet. It will be ready shortly, like within the next few weeks, but it meant that I had to shift around the schedule of what I would be working on and in which order. That is all a scheduling issue on my end, but yes. A simple video works in my favour to sort of straighten out the rest of the upcoming weeks in my own mind too. But that isn't too interesting, and there are a fair few things to talk about with this image anyway. So now we're at the point of the video where I can say that the boring stuff is out of the way for now, and we can move into the fun stuff. That, of course, being the drawing itself. After all, I may have been sort of making it up as I went, but there was still some kind of idea that I began with. Yes, the idea wasn't something great or spectacular, neither was it something I 100% knew myself. But it was something. See, I wanted to draw a forest. I looked at the schedule early this week, saw that I would need something different, and just immediately started to doodle forests and trees. They're a space I simply enjoy drawing from time to time, and I could honestly do it over and over again without any issues, as they're just something fun for me. It's almost like drawing the city skylines I've done before. They're always just fun, so I can repeatedly do them without looking at anything else. Needing a simpler idea for this week? I let myself go ahead with it. I just had to decide in which way I would draw a forest. And I had many routes that would let me do it. Maybe to draw a forest witch. My first idea had been to draw a forest witch. Maybe including a video where I draw different kinds of witches, maybe a water one and a swamp one to accompany her. The second idea I then had was to draw a scene in a clearing. Maybe one inspired by the little dreams I've had, or little moments that I've thought were cute or funny, that I've imagined. If I'd still wanted to work on a character, I could potentially personify the idea of a forest and related spaces maybe. These are all also ideas I will be considering going forward too. I had one idea which would include a bridge rather than a door for a forest. The bridge would be something small and overgrown, yet a sort of old wooden bridge that had almost been forgotten against time. Though in the end I kind of decided that I would take it somewhat easier this week, as I have already touched on. So in the end went with the door idea. The gist of it is that the door is a kind of portal in the middle of a forest with a shallow sort of lake or pond around it. Most of the details are then made up entirely as I went, but I did consider adding a sort of adventurer stumbling across it and standing before it. Though that bit does later get ignored. You see it in the sketch and nowhere else. Since I decided that this part of the idea would take away from the portal element, and truthfully, I simply didn't feel like including them. I didn't want a person to obscure the details of the portal, since the portal is the main focus of the piece. Otherwise, the forest element was also inspired by a few of the local walking places near to me that are finally starting to be usable once more with the changing seasons. I mean, they're open all year round, and going there is possible in winter, but there tends to be a lot more mud to get stuck in, and can be a little less enjoyable. Now? Well, it's fun again. I've been going to a few of them over weekends, which has, rather evidently, made me want to draw forests and trees a bit more than I normally would. Other than all of this, the other motive with it has simply been practice too. My main struggle in drawing is knowing where to stop the background. Like, where to stop drawing trees and bushes and to instead leave all as impressions rather than individual items. So I had been working with that. Initially, the central back tree wasn't going to be there. The entire layer wasn't. Then, during sketching, I decided that it was a little empty, and instead chose to include all of it to see how it went. This was also because I changed the paper rotation though. So whilst I was working, it was landscape, where the original plans in my sketchbook had been portrait and very different to the digital version. So it was something that I went along with and experimented more on as I went. The truth with this drawing is that nothing had been set in stone until I'd actually finished it, and things could have changed even at the last moment. Again, this piece was something of practice, where I'll admit that it didn't go simply or smoothly, or as I initially intended, but it was something new, and it goes over other things that I've wanted to do a bit more lately, yet not really found the chance to or time to, or even the piece to. Though I will touch on that a bit more later. It did mean that things were kind of made up as I went, such as the mist. It was unplanned, and I didn't intend for it in the sketching, but in the end added to the environment in a way that it wouldn't look right without it now. So now moving on to the colour palettes. People have favourite colours. Mine, in case it isn't already obvious, is purple. Well, purple with blue being a close second. But I do enjoy working with purple, and purple as a whole colour. A lot of colours work well with it too, so I have choice in what I do. That is partially the main reason why I ended up with the purple forest, even though I was initially going to use green. It also made it a little more unusual in general. The pops of yellow are a good accent with the palette too, and it draws the eye, yet the purple is unnatural. It sort of goes well with the portal theme and the idea that it is a little off in the image, since, well, the forest isn't normally like this. And portal doors aren't normally in a forest either, but it was mainly also that I enjoyed the colour. It's also a palette that I've been able to experiment a lot with, and I do enjoy sort of pushing what I normally do with it. The green, now that I think about it and now that I look at how it is in purple, would have been boring in comparison, at least in my opinion. Maybe in the future I will do a normal forest, but not with this one where I can mess around a bit more. Though in saying all of that, it doesn't mean that it was easier compared to normal to work with the colours. This is a bit of a tangent, but for some reason I just can't draw things in the colour palette that I intend to use when I'm working digitally. I mean, you'll for sure see it in the video, unless we have passed that part. But I knew going into it that I would want to use the purple palette with the blues and the greens as accents and the yellow. One of the first things I did in the video was establish a palette in the top corner. Yet, in practice, I just couldn't make sense of it as I went. Very early on I was already having issues, so I began to work in grayscale to actually get the shape and forms down before having to think of colour. You'll notice again this is something I do with my characters, where they'll end up with neons until I decide on their colour scheme. Though I don't really know why I struggle with this digitally either. Now I do work a lot of traditional paintings as well, just off camera and off social media. And in those pieces, I don't have this issue. No, it's never really been something that I've had to deal with, so to say. Yet, the moment I'm working on a digital piece, for some reason I just can't work in the normal colours that it will end up as. And I'm not trying to complain about this either. I'm more confused, if anything, as to why this is. Because realistically, there shouldn't be a difference in it. If anyone has any theories as to why this occurs, I am definitely happy to hear them, because it's something that I've been wondering about for a while now too. Yet, yes. I worked in grey and then changed the colours again before actually shading anything. Kind of my normal process here. But who knows? Maybe I will give myself a challenge next week to do it a little differently, to sort of continue the experiments I want to do as of late. I don't really know just yet, the schedule is still a little unclear then, so for now I'm just taking it week by week. Though, getting back on track, I didn't mind how it worked out this time. The colours are sort of something that I've accepted I will address whenever I need to, or whenever it makes sense for me to look at them. And I liked how the grade looked too. I did for a moment consider actually leaving it in grayscale before preferring the colours to it. I have done work like that before, so who knows, maybe in the future I'll return to using a grayscale, but for now I prefer the purple and I am glad that I changed it. See, this is normally the part of the video where I would go into my processes and such, since I have already touched on it in other ways and little comments here and there. But the truth to it this time is that there wasn't much of a linear process to it to really talk about. So instead we can touch on that. I've recently been experimenting more with gouache paint in my sketchbook and on paper, and I have been enjoying it. Before this I used to work with a lot of watercolour and markers, so it's nice to use something a bit different every now and then. Yet, for my flats and base colours, I would use the gouache brush of Clip Studio. So since I've been using the actual paint more for paper and other pieces, I wanted to sort of test what I could do with the brush digitally with this one. Especially since I hardly use it for any shading tones in the work, as I instead favour a pencil tool for it and the blending that it can give me. But using the paint also made me consider how I could use it and what tricks would really translate into a digital sense, and also which ones wouldn't. That is why I did the shading a little differently for this one. And yes, it boils down to me wanting to use a different brush. This is also why I ended up shading a small section off camera. That first yellow plant, and other pieces later on that I can't remember off the top of my head. Just to sort of work out how it would work, as it took a moment to remember how the brush functions. But for the process, it was messing around until something worked, and being okay with going back and forth on it until I was happy with the way it was working out. The side effect of this is that I don't really know what to say about any of the process, since I don't know what I entirely did. There was a lot of going back and forth between brush settings as well and ways that I would use it, and that goes for things like the amount of paint setting and density of paint setting, and sort of seeing how they even affected the brush. It was a lot more of a feeling than a strict process. I can try to talk about the general gist of it, which I suppose is what I have been doing so far. For example, the details. I usually use a lot of impressions in drawing, since to me it's that or detailing everything, which then never looks right. This time I was trying something I do with gouache paint, where it's adding the details in the light and a little bit in the shadows. So, for example, the bush would be a general implication of leaves in the shadows area, with a few on the edge then picked out in the shape of it. But also the lighter sections would have more details picked out in those tones, and also individual plants. I will admit now that it worked better in some areas compared to others. It also works better when I'm painting on paper too, but I think that's down to practice and familiarity. After all, I began with painting and such before doing digital pieces, and only recently switched to working digitally as a majority. Even that is mainly for designing different stickers and products I'm working on, but also normal work, as it has become fun to me. Before this, I used to do a lot of work on paper and canvas and in sketchbooks, and really just messing around with more physical means. And who knows? In the future, I may work out how to record some of the work I do on paper and such, giving me something new to talk about here. But for now, I enjoy working digitally on here, so that is what I'm going to continue to do. For now, I'm merely using it as a little comparison, since the gouache brush and the gouache paint I do think they're meant to be similar, but obviously not an exact match. And I do hope you don't mind the rambling today. As I'm writing this, I kind of know that I'm all over the place. Yet, hey, welcome to how I work sometimes. I tried to order this a little better, but the entire drawing ended up being something all over the place. So there's not really any chronology that I can follow. It's not like with my character videos where I can talk about the processes of one character and then change into the next. The flat tones barely remained too, since I later changed the foreground leaves, and one of my final steps is really just detailing different marks as it wasn't quite right yet. And this does include changing the shapes a little bit here and there. Though, as I've brushed past before, I do end up doing segments of details and shading off camera. Mainly since it was back and forth and would have added another 20 minutes to the end of the video, where you would be watching me shade the same bush 4 or 5 times, undoing any progress on it, and restarting it. There were a few things that I edited out for this one, and a few things that I just didn't record, like the yellow plants. The first one I didn't record. I did that entirely off camera to sort of get a feel for the bush and get a feel for how it would work. I'd already undone the work on the back bush, that I do keep in the video, yet the front plant was my experiment on how it worked. Something to note that I already thought I knew, but evidently forgot. The plants after that, in the foreground, I did film my earlier attempts at them, yet ended up cutting them in order to keep this version in, that worked and that I liked, and to avoid an extra 20 minutes of footage. And to avoid any extra footage that would have made this needlessly long, since it would be boring for you to watch and I would run out of things to say. Now, I know I again mentioned it earlier, but I have time to address it in more detail. So, in the original sketch, I did a very basic framework for a person, as I felt that I could potentially include them. And yes, I've already said that I simply didn't want to include them and changed my mind. But again, I have more time to expand on things without it derailing the script too much. It is a small detail, a small thing that realistically wouldn't have taken me too long to add into the piece in the end. So then, why didn't I? If it was a time thing, I would be unhappy with myself, since it would feel like cutting corners for the sake of keeping schedule. And it is a little more than just not wanting to, like I originally said. But it made it into what I will graciously call the final sketch, which normally means it would be included and then I later ignored it. I suppose this time the answer is simply that I didn't know what I would want them to look like, and that they take up the majority of the focus in front of the portal. The issue of placement was really the main reason they're not added in the end. I mean, I could have added them in the water too and had them smaller to still include a focus on the portal. My other option was to increase the size of the door, drawing the eye via scale. But it made little sense to resize everything around for an element that I didn't feel like it fit too well anyway. My other option had been to include them on the side of the grass, maybe by a tree or something, or sat on the side. All of them were quite valid options and things that I did toy with at the beginning. Yet, in the end, it felt right without them. Yes, a person is a visual interest and a focal point, yet the portal could do that on its own, and it already felt like a complete piece by the time that I'd finished it. I sort of worked on it with the idea that, yes, I could have included them at any point, and I would go back and work them into it at the end if I still thought that they were needed. The sketch is a suggestion at the very basic point. The person was a final element that I added to that stage, and even then, toyed with and removed a few times. And this way of thinking, knowing that I could go in and add the person at the end, worked for me in this piece. It meant I wasn't forcing something that I didn't want to include, and that I wasn't shutting off ideas before ever even trying them. It was sort of a healthy middle point in the experiment too, since adding the person would have changed the piece a slight way. After all, my other issue with the figure was trying to picture how they would look. I didn't have an image in my head like I normally do for these things. And, it would help set the tone and change the environment of the piece, considering how I made them look. A more fantasy-style explorer may have made sense with the portal. Yet I also considered a person in more comfortable clothes that looks as if someone from today just happened to stumble across it, adding more to the mystery and the intrigue. Both ideas would have made sense, and yet both would have been slightly different stories and images that people could interpret. So, in the end, I decided to set the idea on the shelf for next time. And it is there if I ever want to revisit it. I have a few ideas like that every now and then, especially with this image too. With all of that said, and I know I've mentioned the experiment, it's also been fun this week with all of the other ideas I've ended up with on said metaphorical shelf. Yes, the idea of the adventurer is one, yet there are also those I touched on earlier when discussing the inspiration and early ideas. So, who knows? I may develop ideas soon for different kinds of witches, or personify different types of environments in an upcoming video. At the current moment, I will simply let it all sit until I have a stronger idea for each. But who knows what's coming up next, since the schedule is still a little bit iffy. It's later in the week at this point when I'm recording this, and I still haven't really gotten a clue of how it's going to go yet. So we will simply see how it all plays out. They may be soon, they may be in a few years down the line. But the ideas are there on the shelf, and I kind of have a new wave of inspiration from this experiment that will be fun to explore in different ways. Yet with all of that said, we are now coming up on the end of my talking points here, hence why I'm expanding on brief points from earlier and sort of repeating myself a little more than I normally allow. But there is one more thing I want to mention before we go. One little point left on the list. See, I do these videos and also run a shop over on Etsy with a range of different designs and stickers at the moment. I have mentioned this before, and I will likely mention it again, as I have ideas for new products besides stickers and what is currently listed. Yet I do want to say that I will be soon updating the shop with a handful of new designs. There will be more on this in the coming weeks on both here and my socials, as I get closer to the update. But there are some designs I myself am looking forward to. Some are based on space, and there are some for moths too. A lot of them are really based around my interests and stickers that I would use, so I'm quite excited for them. And I'm excited for everyone and myself to have access to them. So if that is something that interests people, keep an eye and ear out for them, as it should be coming shortly, and I will be able to touch on it in the next few videos until the update is here. And in the future, stick around because there will be new updates frequently added, whether it be stickers or the new products I have in mind. Now with all of that said, I'm running out of talking points and we are coming up on the end of the video. So let's start wrapping all of this up here, shall we? Out of everything, I do like the outcome. It's something different than what I normally do and further than my normal comfort zone than I normally post on here. I could have easily spent this week on other character ideas I had, and maybe gone with something closer to what I'm used to. Even with the forest idea, I could have stayed with what I knew rather than changing my shading routine so much. The reason I say that is because I hardly use my normal shading brushes for most of this. Only in the later stages do I introduce them to finish elements off, and I like how it looks. The process is different, something new to me, and entirely an experiment, hence why I've not really touched on much of the thought process behind it and what I was doing with it, since that is something I didn't think much about, and it isn't really something that I made notes of with the amount of back and forth included. Things like this are fun to do every now and then, whilst they are still simple for these sorts of weeks where there's small scheduling errors on my side. Hopefully, it will be sorted soon. But being said, I hope you all have enjoyed it too. Sorry that the script has been a bit all over the place and that I couldn't exactly explain everything I do with it normally, but I still hope you've enjoyed. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you all next week with whatever happens to unfold there. It could go either way right now with planning. But again, we will have to see. For now, goodbye.